What's going on, everybody? Gar Hoover here, and today we're going to be going through my track Bounce that I made on the PO-33. Bounce uses samples from Andrew Huang's sample pack for his video called Weird Sax Techniques, where he records Moon Hooch, a band that uses a contrabass clarinet and a bass saxophone and gets some really awesome sounds. And the cool part about this track is that it's using only those two instruments to create all of the sounds that you hear. If you want the samples, just go to Andrew Huang's video, Weird Sax Techniques, and you can download them there. And with that being said, let's take a look at this track. Alright, so let's start off first by talking about the samples. As you all know, these come from a bass saxophone and a contrabass clarinet. This second sample here, this one kind of, you can tell, is pretty harmonically rich, but it serves as my sub bass, if you want to call it that. What I do is pitch down the sample, but then I also add a filter to it. As you can hear, when I adjust the resonance, it really brings out different tones. When I start to add the filter, it starts to behave more as a bass, as it removes a lot of the upper harmonics. This is a sample of them just tapping the saxophone, and it serves well to make kind of like a plucky guitar sound. But a lot of this track kind of has some wubby dubstep tones to it, and that's this sample right here. When I pitch it down and start to use it, it really creates that more of like a metallic-y wub. This is just a more percussive hit. And this final one I actually ended up not even using, but it's a really pitched up version of those percussive tones. Let's take a look at the drums here. Oh, you can hear I've still got a high pass filter and it all pitched up funny and stuff. Let me adjust the filter real quick. Okay, there we go. And as you can hear, these aren't your normal drum kit sounds. These are all samples of the saxophone and that clarinet. They're just really percussive. And you can hear that this one actually is a pitched up version of this alternate snare. And I just brought it up outside in a DAW. And I also ended up layering the hi-hat sound on top of the other samples as well. You can hear each one of these has it layered on top. And that helps me from using more than one track for drums. I can keep them all on one track. The next sample I used was kind of this lead line that they recorded. And this is actually just the sped up version of it. The original version, let me just pitch it down. So that's the original sample, but then I just brought it up a whole octave and it speeds it up a lot faster and it kind of adds that energy. Then I've got this other really odd sample that I use kind of as a transition effect. And this one is the sample of that contrabass clarinet, but this one actually served as the sample that I used for the lead sounds that I made. You'll hear some of these. You hear those wubs at the end. Those I actually ended up copy pasting into the melodic banks to create those other lead sounds that you hear. I have another sound effect one that I use as a transition. Again, kind of like white noise or something like that. Adds a little bit energy, and it can add a little intrigue to a looping pattern. Another really weird kind of effect that also serves as a transition sound. And then I have these audio chops from Andrew Huang at the beginning of the video that if I bring them back down to their normal pitch, you can kind of hear them talking in here. Oh, let me bring down that high pass filter too. So when you put a sample in the drum bank of the pocket operator, it creates those transients, which you can hear right here. And I decided to make just a clean sample of it on the 16th step. And then I made a copy just to make it a little bit easier later on when I use the vocal samples. And that's going to do it for all the samples that I use in the track. Now it's time to take a look at the actual verse of the track. So that's all there is to the entire verse. Let's take a look at this first pattern and specifically this weird transitional sound that kind of brings us into the verse. And you can hear though, it kind of fades out, and that's because I actually am controlling the filter and recording it in. I'm holding down right. Let me show you. So that's how it sounds without any filter. It carries out a little too long. And there I'm bringing up the high pass filter and bringing out those lower frequencies, and it's serving to only last as long as the first pattern instead of tailing into other content longer than I want it to. So now let's take a look at the drums for this section. You can see my kicks are on 1, 2, 4, 8, and 11. And you can hear those start to thud in. And I've got my snare on 5 and 13, very standard placement in a sequence. And any other step is filled in with a hi-hat. If it's open step, I just filled it in with the hi-hat. So now we just have a steady 16th note groove with the hi-hat because each one of the samples has the hi-hat layered on them. So you can also hear I have that bass wub sound, that horn sound, kind of in sync with the kicks. It's kind of hitting on 1, 2, 4, 8, 11. But you can also see sometimes the kicks and the wubs aren't always in sync necessarily, so it keeps it with this bounce, but it keeps it tight as well. We got 1, 2, 4, 8, 11, 14 for this final pattern, so there's a little bit of variation in there. But when we look at the horns, if I highlight them, we got 1, 2, 4, 8, 11, 15, 16, which aren't in sync with the kick, so they add that kind of bouncy rhythm that adds that funk to it all. And speaking of that funk, that means we have to use the minor pentatonic scale. So you're going 13, 15, 16, 9, 11, and then it duplicates itself for the upper octave. And that's how you get that funkier bluesy sound. And you can hear that with this other pluck sound in the background as well. So the two melodic samples for this section are both using the minor pentatonic scale. Obviously the plucks are a little bit higher up and kind of on a different rhythm. But you can hear this pattern is somewhat similar to the other patterns. We only have an A and a B pattern to the verse, but I'm using 4 different patterns. And that's because I'm creating alternates. I have 2 different versions of each pattern that I'm using. So pattern number 3 kind of serves as the second half almost of pattern 1. So you can hear there's some alternate kind of percussive hits and things going on there because these alternate hits kind of add that variation that keeps our ears interested. So you can hear this is that alternate snare that I created, but I have it pitched up really high. And this higher pitch snare hit is on step 15. Now for step 16, if you hear it, it's a little bit lower. So I pitch down that same snare hit in between the original sample pitch and the octave up. So somewhere in like right underneath that one dude's feet on the screen if you want to use that as a reference. And if we listen to the sample though, it's not 2 single hits. We hear a clicking, a double hit. And what we do there is obviously pitch it up and then punch it in for this first one, but that's not all, because you're going to hear it. That doesn't sound as good. It doesn't have that same snare roll to it. So we're going to hold down that sample and then press BPM. And now it says TR2, which means it's triggering 2 times that sample for that step. So by having those triggers on 15 and 16, it creates this drum fill type of sound with those snare hits, and it adds some flavor to it. So let's look at the alternate version of this second pattern on pattern 4. So you can kind of hear there, it really does serve to help us transition into the next section, which is the build. And so those claps really just help let us know something bigger is about to happen. And we actually hear those claps in the first version of the second half of these patterns. And that's the clap from Andrew Huang when he always does that at the beginning of his videos, that classic clap, and I decided to sample it in. And so we have those claps on 8 and 10 that provide that bounce. But on the 4th pattern, you'll see here, we have it going down 2 vertical rows. The first vertical row and the 3rd vertical row all the way down. And that just serves to create that build and that tension that something's coming. But we also hear these 2 vocal samples right at the end that actually transition us into the build. And so I pitched it down, and that's all it is just 4, 5, 6 lined up, how they chopped it up nicely on the pocket operator. And the phrase, I think that's it, serves really well to help contribute to the build as we get into that section next. but let me just show you guys one more time what it sounds like. So almost every single aspect of this final pattern is leading us into the build, which we're going to talk about next. Alright, so now we're going to talk about the build. Let me play it for you guys first. As you can hear, there are a lot of complicated things going on, lots of high-pass filters, builds, changes in pitch, all kinds of crazy stuff that leads into the chorus really well. So let's first talk about this sax lead that we hear at the beginning of the build. Sounds like it kind of got overwhelmed there, but this is a great time to talk about synchronizing your samples. So you can see I'm at 70 BPM, but this original sample was at 140, so I'm technically at half the speed. The pocket operator did a great job at starting the sample right at the beginning so it keeps it all in sync. And you can see all I need to do is trigger it on the first step of each pattern, and then it loops around nice and clean, even for the 7th pattern. And for this final pattern though, it's triggered on quarter notes, except for the final one it's getting choked out, which I'll talk about later. So you can see it's just getting triggered every single time and looping around. Nothing too crazy is happening here. But on the 3rd pattern, pattern number 7, we start to hear a change in the saxophone, and that's because I am adjusting the filter on this 3rd pattern as it builds into the final one. I'm holding down right and then just turning the high pass filter to the right, and it's bringing out all of the lower frequencies and changing the tone of the saxophone. And you can really hear that on that final pattern right there, where it's starting to sound really thin and it's building this tension. And we see those triple triggers right there on quarter notes. And so that's how it sounds, but I don't want it to carry out the entire sample. So I sequence in this dead section of the sample that serves as a choke for it. So it's stopping the sample from carrying out clean and is just a dead section of the sample that's really short. And by stopping the saxophone sample, it lets this final section with the "Hey, it's Andrew Huang" really shine. And I can't emphasize enough how important it is to bring up that high pass filter in your builds, or adjusting the filter at all, because it adds that additional tension to the rest of your stuff. And you're going to hear that here as we talk about the drums now for the build. So what I'm doing here is taking my deeper snare sound and I am lining it up on the 1st vertical row and the 3rd vertical row, as you can hear here. And it is a classic 8th note rhythm, kind of like a clap that you'd hear at the beginning of a build or something like that. So in the 2nd pattern, we're not only hearing those snare hits, we're now hearing an additional sound that's going to be on the 2nd and 4th rows, and that's the hi-hat. So it's adding just a little bit more energy. It's filling in that alternate 8th notes, which makes it a 16th note groove instead. And as we transfer over to this 3rd pattern, you can hear the snares are really coming into their own here. So this is where we get a lot of that automation that's taking place. We're recording it in. So you can see snares are just filling up every single possible step on this 3rd pattern here. But you can hear they're going up in pitch. And by adding that pitch effect to the snare, it's kind of letting us know we're building into something that's bigger and larger and greater. So let me show you how you can do this on your own tracks as well. So I started off with it just in the middle, or a little bit lower, I think, maybe something like that. And what I did was right, punch it in, and then you adjust it 1, press right, and then punch it into the next step. And then you adjust it 1 more, press right, punch it in. Adjust it 1 more, press right, punch it in. And you do this tedious process, but it ends up creating this build that's gradual and steady and rhythmic. So you can hear it's this steady build that's taking place. It's not kind of slipping around or sloppy as it goes up in pitch. And you can hear on this 4th pattern, we've got the pitch still going up. And that pitch is increasing every single step of the sequence for this fourth pattern, and so it's getting really high, intense. The pitch is growing more and more, but we're also doing it double time triggers. So we're holding down a note and pressing BPM to create that super fast build instead of it just on 16th notes. So they're triggered 4 times for this, and that's going to create a really, really intense build instead, which you'll hear. It's just really contributing to that classic EDM build. And you can hear each one of these has the high pass filter all the way turned up almost, where we can barely hear much of the low end on these samples even when they're pitched up. So what I'm doing is I'm holding down right while I have the filter selected and bringing up the high pass filter, creating that sweeping tension that contributes alongside the pitch. But you also hear other white noise sounds taking place in the background, and that's one of my sound effects that I have triggered on the third pattern here, which I'll show you guys. It's pretty simple. We already saw it earlier. It's just this weird building sound that's kind of sweeping. It's triggered on the first step of the third pattern of the build, and all it really does is just carry itself out. I don't have to do anything to it. It just kind of continues itself on. You can hear it in the background here. And it cuts out about halfway on the fourth pattern of the build. On step 9 or so, it cuts off just because that's the end of the sample. So it ends up being a pretty clean cut, and it helps let our ear know something else is about to happen. We're going to have a transition here after this build. And another important part of the build are the vocal samples. And one of them we heard on pattern 4 transitions into the bridge here. So you can see it kind of serves to help this transition along. And these are the same samples that we heard earlier. It's the I think that's it that's kind of chopped up, and that it ends up landing on the first vertical row, which creates this clean quarter note groove for the it in I think that's it. So when we look at the sample itself, we have the I that takes place on 4, but here, let me remove the filter for it. I had it a little bit of the low end cut out because it had a lot of additional unwanted sounds in it. You can hear for the vocal chops there that we're bringing in a high pass filter and bringing it up. We're twisting it up, and it's creating this effect, letting us know that we're once again going to increase in intensity for the rest of the build. So let's talk about this third pattern for the build right here. Pattern number 7. It's this Hey It's Andrew Huang sample. That's all it is. It's just a Hey It's Andrew Huang. It's just the beginning chop. So the Hey It's. Let me oh crap. Okay, so I accidentally just moved where the sample is triggered from. Let me just try and fix this real quick for you guys. Alright, I think that's pretty good. Yeah, there we go. Sounds really good, building back up into normal. So it sounds pretty solid. And you can hear there that it's the beginning of the sample of Hey It's Andrew Huang, so it leads in well to the ending drop. So what we do here to get this effect is it's pitched all the way down. So that sounds about right for the starting pitch. So then you punch it in, press right, and then you press right and punch it in again. Press right, punch it in. You keep adjusting the pitch little by little to build up. And then the other thing that we hear going on here is the high pass filter. So I'm holding down right and bringing up the high pass filter to the right, thinning it out as you hear it losing its presence, especially on this final pattern here. So let's talk about this final pattern actually. As you can see, I've got almost every single one of the steps filled in with an adjustment of pitch. Let me get to that. So I'm literally just triggering it really fast right here, and you, as we've been doing, you adjust the pitch, press right, punch it in, adjust the pitch, press right, punch it in, and that tedious progress really helps make this sound like a classic EDM drop. As you can hear right there, it's pretty high up, but it's also pretty thin because the high pass filter is being affected still. as that was recorded in. And also notice that the "Hey, it's Andrew Huang" isn't being triggered on this sound. It's actually in its own drum bank being triggered at its own time, because when I tried to bring the high pass filter down, it created this clicking sound that I didn't want. So I decided I'll just have it be its own separate sample that's triggered on its own sound bank.
Hey, it's Andrew Huang.
So there, it's got no filter, it's just nice and clean, and so that just helps it really stand out right before we get to this drop in the chorus, which we're about to take a look at next. Alright, so now it's time to take a look at the drop. Alright, so let's just take a look at this beginning section, because there's already a lot to cover here that will actually help us understand the sections that come later in the chorus. So let's begin first. We've got that classic sax sound that we had building up. Alright, so let's get there. Oh, let me adjust the filter for it real quick. And it sounds really quiet. There we go. So that's still looping, doing its thing. Nothing really crazy is happening except for this final pattern, which has a few little things going on than just letting the sample run the whole time. So we have that first sample, and then we have a choke that's taking place on the 13th, which I'll talk about in a little bit. But we hear first and foremost that I'm adjusting the high pass filter a little bit, creating this kind of transitional sound and contributing to it. And then also we have the choke that's taking place that's also letting us know that we're kind of transitioning out of this drop with the saxophone into something else. But before we jump to that other section, let's talk about the drums for this section, because the drums are really high energy and they have more of a trap flair than a funk groove that we heard in the beginning. So we've got the kick on 1, 8, 10, and 11. So this kick pattern is happening for every single one of these patterns for the saxophone section. It's still 1, 8, 10, 11. Staying pretty common and familiar. We've got the snare that's taking place on 5 and 13, just like every other pattern that we've had thus far. But where most of the energy for these drums is coming from is from the hi-hats. The hi-hats are fast, they're busy, they're very trappy, I guess if you want to call them that. I'm filling in any empty space with a hi-hat here, and it just gives so much energy to this section that is lacking, honestly, when we don't have the hi-hats in it. And once again, I can't emphasize this enough. Layering the hi-hat on top of the kick outside the PO-33 makes it so much easier, because I'm using only one drum track to create all of my drums. So you can hear I've got that rolling hi-hat sound, and that's the first hi-hat pitched up really high on 3, and then on 4 it's pitched down a little bit more. I then go on to trigger them 4 times a piece, and this just creates that slipping, dripping, trappy hi-hat sound that you hear. And this hi-hat, man, it sounds perfect to do it with because it's got those extra textures taking on. And you can hear those other hi-hats are being triggered more than once too. This one on 9 is being triggered 2 times, and then also on 12, as you'll hear, we've got it being triggered. It sounds like 4 times. Yeah, that was 4 times. So having a multiple triggered hi-hat right before your snare really helps add that perfect energy that you're looking for. It sounds so good when you've got that hi-hat that's kind of leading into the snare and adding that confidence. And you can also hear here that I'm using the same snare rolls from the verses in this part of the drop. Listen here at the end. And all I did was just copy paste them from the verse into the drop right there, and it works out well. So it's the same drum pattern for the second pattern, but then we also have the alternate of the second pattern. That's the final one. And that just cuts off right at the snare hit, and I have nothing else for the final section, so that kind of sucks out all of the energy for a second and really helps us focus on those vocal chops leading into the next section. And since that finishes up the drums, I think it's time we talk about those vocal chops. So let me remove the high pass filter and, oh, don't want to touch the trim again. Let's adjust the pitch back to where it was. It was pretty low. You know what? Instead of me trying to do that, let me just jump right to the chops themselves in the track. Wait a minute, this is the first pattern. Let me jump to the second one. Right here. So we have that I think that's it again, but it's on 13, 14, 15, and the it's on 15, which is a little bit different than how it was in the build, where the it was landing on the quarter notes. So that just adds a little bit of a difference to the same sample and where you decide to place it, but it also harkens back to the drop. So now let's take a look at this final sample that's used for this section. So we hear this other sound that is part of the hey it's Andrew Huang, but when you play it like that, it almost sounds like hey let's get it, something along those lines, and serves as a great transition into the next section. So you can actually hear it's part of the hey it's Andrew Huang, but it's just chopped up funny and adds intrigue. And it's starting before the snare hit where everything drops out. So you start to hear it fading in almost, and then once the snare hits and everything cuts out, it really stands out well. Now let's take a look at the bass line for this section, because it's using that weird horn sub bass that I talked about in the intro. It's really sloppy, it's really dirty sounding, it sounds great for this section. So you can hear there that the bass is almost being cut off, if you want to call it, cut off by the snare hit. But it's not the case. I'm actually just holding down the note and turning the right knob to adjust the length so that it's only going 4 steps and then stopping at the snare. So this bass line is actually pretty simple when we walk through it. That's the next note in the minor pentatonic scale. And it's just walking up the scale, really simple. That's all there is to it for this bass line. But when we listen to the second half of the chorus in that next pattern, we hear that it goes up, but then it walks back down on that 16 and 15 of the scale. So that's how it sounds. You can see where I have those notes punched in. And if you remember how the kick pattern looked, we're kind of similar in keeping the kicks aligned with the bass line. And so it keeps it all feeling really tight and gets that good groove to it all. But we also have this final pattern, which is like the alternate of the second pattern. You can hear the bass is being cut off right at the snare, right before the let's get it part. And all that is adjusting the length so it only goes 2 steps of the sequence and then gets cut off by the snare. Right there, and it keeps it nice and tight. And lets us know that we're kind of going to transition into another section, or it's going to loop back. And in this case, we're going to another section of the track that's a little more almost dubsteppy, if you want to call it that. So as you can probably tell, this second half of the chorus kind of has a different level of energy to it, but there are some similarities that are taking place between the two sections. So let's take a look at the contrabass clarinet sample I used. So this bass line kind of has a minor pentatonic vibe, but it's got a few notes that aren't necessarily in it, so it adds a little bit more menacing feel to it. But when I hit that note, the 9 right there, several times, I'm moving the filter and moving in and out high pass so that it creates this more evolving sound to it. So when I trigger that note 6 times there, I'm holding down right and I'm twisting the knob, and it's creating all these textures you wouldn't normally get from just the bass clarinet by itself. Something else I want to point out here with this bass line is where the notes are changing. So we have it on 1, we have those notes, and then 4 is where we have the next note change. And then we have it on 7, which carries through all the way to 13. And if we look at the kicks, we have them lining up sometimes with some of these changes in notes. or the end of one of the changes or the final note for a section. And so that mixed with the kicks really adds this synchronization between the kick drum and the bass and the snare, and it just helps add a little bit more glue to the sound that you wouldn't normally get. And if we're talking about the drums now, it's very simple. I just have it filled in with the hi-hats and the empty spaces. I've got that one that's triggered 4 times right before the final snare of the pattern. And the snares, once again, just 5 and 13. But then we also have here on 8 and 10 2 different alternate snares that kind of add that bounce to it. And so those kind of are in the space where we have that movement in the bass line. So it's adding a little bit more texture and variation to that section that you wouldn't normally get. And you might also notice that this section of the drop is a little bit more spacious sounding, and that's because we're only using 3 of the 4 available audio slots that you can utilize at once on the pocket operator. So now let's take a look at these vocal chops. So these vocal chops are really behaving like the lead line for this section. And all we're really doing is just messing around with where the pocket operator decided to chop up, hey, it's Andrew Huang. And they're pitched down, obviously, too. So it adds that additional EDM flair to it. And it's always coming back to the let's get it thing that we are introduced to at the beginning half of the chorus. So you can hear on that second pattern that we're adding something additional to it, and that's the only real variation between them, and that's just this hey, hey, but we don't have the H sound on the beginning of it. It's just an AA, but it's a pitched up version of that beginning sound. And even though this second half of the drop might sound different than the first section, we have that lead-in sound from the vocal chop. So right there you can hear that they kind of are glued together because they both utilize the same vocal chop. And the second half of the drop actually transitions well into the outro. And when you hear this section, you might think that it sounds pretty similar, and it is actually. It's the chorus, it just doesn't have the saxophone, no saxophone in it. And so it just has the same vibes and the same drums, the same bass line. A lot of it is the same exact thing as we saw with the chorus. It's just a little bit more open feeling, as you can probably tell. We have these little saxophone chops that are taking place. They're just going down that third vertical row. I didn't want anything too complicated for the outro just because I wanted it to kind of calm us down a little bit before coming back around, and that third vertical row kind of adds that bounce to it all that you like when you listen to the trap music or something, that offbeat kind of feel. But we also see that there's a second pattern here that kind of leads us out of the section nicely. All it is just that additional, hey, it's Andrew Huang there. Everything's getting cut off nice and clean as we had seen in the first half of the chorus, or the drop if you want to call it that. Let me bring up the pitch of the hey, it's Andrew Huang. So you can hear there's a little bit of a click, but it really is ending the sample right before we get to that next section so that there's no overlap or anything taking place. And I needed to make sure of that as well when it came to the bass, because we have one on the 16th step, we have a note triggered. So we need to make sure that only lasts one step. So you can hear that transition sounds really clean. There's no overlap, there's no sounds that are cutting each other off or anything. And it's just keeping everything from bleeding into each other, keeps everything sounding tight. And that's going to have to do it for today's tutorial, guys. I hope you all really enjoyed it. If you have any questions for me, leave them in the comments below. If you want to watch more videos like this, check out my playlist here, whether it's tutorials or just listening to any of the songs I've made. I do a lot with pocket operators and the OPZ. And as always, please like and subscribe. I hope to see you all in the next video.